continuing along on our afternoon journey through various types of case studies. I have another case study for you. This time we're going to talk about ontologies and knowledge management. And this is going to be a case study from Ubisoft, which is a gaming company. And to present today, we have Fortin and Lehnert, who's Senior Manager of Graphite at Synaptica. Aaron, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share my screen here. That's the right one. And okay, so first let me preface by saying that unfortunately Melanie could not be here. She's from Ubisoft. She has been extremely sick. And so we've had to work around that. Unfortunately, she could not make it. So I wish her well, although she's not here or on the call, because I know she was quite sick. I was quite concerned about her. Sounds like she's doing okay, but not well enough to be here. So I apologize for the fact that the person who really should be presenting the content is not on the call, because obviously she is the client and she is the one representing what they're doing, and so she knows it better than I do. However, I do know some of what they're doing, so I'll talk to that some today, and hopefully I can field some of your questions, and if not, hopefully we can pass some of these on and somehow get answers to you or more information to you in the long term here. So I'll just introduce myself. I'm Fortin and Lehnert, Senior Manager of Graphite at Synaptica, and I've been in the industry for nearly 20 years now, as you can see by my extremely simplified timeline of when I was born, when I became a taxonomist, and when I came here to talk to you. I live in Oakland, California. I've listed some of my likes and dislikes. I am a very avid swimmer, except for this week, since this conference is taking all of my time. I've not been able to get in the pool very much. And I don't like celery. I don't know why. I just don't like celery. A little bit about Synaptica. So we've been in the industry for over 25 years now. Last year was our 25th anniversary. We didn't really get to celebrate much, not in person anyway. But yeah, we have been in the industry for 25 years, and we provide taxonomy and ontology software, as well as text analytics capabilities and professional services. And as you'll see in this presentation, we work very closely with our clients to develop our software. They come to us with requirements. We try to get those requirements into the system, and then those things that we put into the system for a client are shared in a common code base. So that means that we've got one version of our software. We typically don't put our software out there to be customized, or we don't customize it for clients. If we're going to customize it for a client, we customize it for all of our clients. And that's sort of our modus operandi, and that's what we like to do. And so a lot of this presentation is about what we did for Ubisoft and what their requirements were and how we tried to match those. So Ubisoft. This is one of our clients. Again, I wish that Melanie were here to present this content herself. That would be very exciting, because they're doing much more than I'm even aware of, but I'll do my best here. You probably know Ubisoft. They're a software company. They develop video games and other software. Among their many titles, you probably recognize something like Assassin's Creed, which has both been obviously a video game and movies. They develop a lot of content. Very interesting company to work with. So, Ubisoft had some business challenges. So they required some modernization of their systems and interfaces, and what they really wanted to be able to do is centralize vocabulary management. And so they needed to have software to centralize their vocabulary management and to provide standardized concepts across the organization. And so one of the key components of this was to be able to integrate with multiple commercial and proprietary systems, including Atlassian, Confluence, and Microsoft SharePoint, that they could push vocabularies out to. They also had the requirement that their content creators needed to not only be able to create and tag content from their taxonomies, but they needed to be able to suggest concepts. And as many of you may know, if you're working in this space, suggesting concepts is potentially a tricky business, right? It's you can get ungoverned lists of enterprise keywords and a lot of mismatches and a lot of near synonymous terms, similar concepts that have been introduced. So this takes a lot of governance and it takes a lot of planning. So we'll get into that a little bit about how they were able to allow their content creators to suggest tags, but in a governed and orderly fashion. As I mentioned, they're going to integrate with numerous homegrown and commercially available systems. So they needed that flexibility to deal with things that were sort of commercial, off the shelf, out of the box software, and also customize things that they had built internally for their own systems. And they, as I mentioned, they wanted to support the creation, tagging, and retrieval of product and user-specific content. And finally, they needed robust group-based user and permissions management. We'll get into that a little more as to why they needed that. But we did some system integration help for them, and we started using RDF star, which I'll talk about in this presentation. We won't get deeply into that. I'm not the tech guy. I'm not the dev guy. So I know a little bit about it, but I'll keep it at a higher level. But we'll talk a little bit about the RDF star standard and how we use that to give them the permissions that they needed. And all of this work was, again, it was all about supporting the creation and tagging of content without the users and the content creators having to become taxonomists. We don't need those users to become taxonomists. They've got an expertise, they've got a job to do, but we want to support them with taxonomy functionality. So you will probably recognize some of these business challenges. They had outdated content. It was difficult to find through browse or search because it was inconsistent or missing metadata altogether. Probably sounds familiar. There was no way to discover new content. Users would recreate existing content because it could not be found. Again, this probably all sounds familiar. And finally, taxonomy management was really inefficient. Included a lot of concepts which were simply not valuable to the business. So they kind of had to do some internal cleanup of their vocabularies and find a better way to manage these things so that users could use them. So what did we do to help them? So we developed an Atlassian Confluence connector, which we'll talk a little bit about. And then, as I mentioned, that RDF star-based permissions management, that was some of the work that we did. There was some other customization we built into the tool for them, but those were some of the bigger things. So they used our software called Graphite. They're using that for ontology management. And as I mentioned, we integrated with Atlassian Confluence and Microsoft SharePoint. And those were the only two custom integrations we had to build. Because they are what they are. SharePoint is a unique beast, and so you kind of have to develop a connector in order to connect to it properly. And with the Confluence connector, Confluence, just like SharePoint, they have out-of-the-box tagging, but there's certain functionality that didn't really support, especially in Confluence. Their tagging, they're not built to be a taxonomy management system. That's not what they do. So there's tagging available, but it wasn't very robust. So we wanted to extend the functionality that was available there. And as I mentioned, these content creators, they are creating Confluence wiki pages, and they want to tag those with concepts from their taxonomies and ontologies. And as I also mentioned, editors want to be able to suggest concepts in the tagging interface, and that's what's important. Again, they shouldn't have to go to a taxonomy ontology management tool to suggest concepts. They want to do it from their workflow when they're creating and tagging content. And of course, these concepts can't just be put into some bucket of keywords to be reused because that quickly spirals out of control. So these suggested concepts that get thrown into the system are reviewed by a dedicated team of ontologists. And then finally, this new RDF star-based user and group permissions. So this was our answer to their requirements. So within our system, one of the things they really needed to do was govern the content they were creating and govern their vocabularies. And so what we helped them do was develop specific governance properties and relationships. So, of course, most taxonomy management systems should have permissions, and they should have the ability to create or ingest properties and relationships, and there should be this concept of workflow and governance built right into the system. And so what we tried to do for them was to help them identify what it was that constituted governance. So an approver comment, a subject matter expert comment, a reviewer comment, a reviewer date, a ready for edit, yes or no, those kinds of properties that they needed to customize their workflow for governance. So we helped them identify what those were and develop those in the system. They also needed to manage the using the out-of-the-box concept status. They needed to be able to manage their concepts by status. And that status is really a key to their whole workflow of content, of users suggesting concepts and them being able to review and approve. So these are the statuses that we have out of the box in our system, but these names could change depending on your system that they're using for taxonomy management. Things typically go in as a concept, as a candidate concept, and then they could move through this workflow of being approved and then finally published so they could be reused by other content creators. So as I mentioned, they wanted to be the ability to tag pages in Confluence with both existing and suggested concepts. Now, you'll see here in this screenshot, this example, this is not their content. It looks exactly like how they do it, but I'm not at liberty to use their content, so I've mocked up another screen here. But as you can see in the screenshot, you've got a page, and on this page, you can have tagging panes, and this is really customizable as many relationships as you want in whichever vocabularies you want. So again, this was in this particular example, you can see I've got GEMIT and UNESCO, which are publicly available vocabularies. They are using their proprietary customized vocabularies that they developed in-house to tag their content that they've created. So they're using things strictly that are of their business and that are proprietary and that they developed. But what's nice is that they can put these in here, tag their content, see it there on the page, and as you can see in this screenshot, there's a little plus sign there where they can create a tag concept. So in this particular screenshot, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change wasn't a concept that was in this vocabulary, the UNESCO vocabulary. So I can type that in and say add it. And then it can be targeted. It can either go into that vocabulary or into sort of a holding vocabulary. I hate to use words like general or miscellaneous or other, but you can develop a different vocabulary where it's candidate concepts and then review those, approve them, and then move them to the place they should be within. Because again, your users shouldn't be taxonomous. I mean, they might be, but they really shouldn't have to be. So they shouldn't have to know, oh, what form should my term take, and where should it go in the vocabulary, and what structure, what branch should I put it in my vocabulary. They don't have to know that. All they have to know is, I don't see the concept, I need this concept, I'm suggesting it, so that the real experts, the ontologists, the subject matter experts, the taxonomists on the back end can make those choices about where this goes in the vocabulary. And as you can see, this is an extension of that page. And something else that they wanted was to be able to see certain fields from the concept. So again, we're surfacing things from the taxonomy management system without them having to look at a taxonomy management system, which is kind of important to them. So here I've got the main label, this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I've got an alt label, IPCC, and then I've got a description. And that description actually comes from linked data, and we'll talk a little bit about their future plans to use more of that. So essentially, the workflow. Concepts are managed throughout their life cycle, beginning to end, whether they were created newly in the taxonomy management system, and that's a taxonomist adding a term or importing terms perhaps, or if it's suggested by content creators. So you can manage both of those. These concepts are available then to consuming systems once they're approved, and they can be filtered by status or a concept that we have of collection. You might call it a category. And what that allows us to do is say, on the front end, only show concepts that are in a given status. So say published. The collections feature is even nicer, because then you can say, I have a large vocabulary. I'm going to add a label that includes concepts perhaps from all over the vocabulary, or even multiple vocabularies. I want you just to show those as a filtered view so you can tag just using those concepts. Because I think what we're seeing a lot of at our organization is people want taxonomies, people want ontologies, but they struggle with the concept that everybody wants their own version of it, right? So do you develop 100 taxonomies, or do you develop one taxonomy? How do you do this? It's sort of an age-old question. And frequently what happens is they develop a few taxonomies that are shallower. That seems to be the direction I'm seeing. Fewer large, robust, deep taxonomies, and instead more and shallow, less hierarchy, less depth taxonomies, and filtering those to the view that the users want using some feature or another, whether that's a collection, as I mentioned, or a status, or some other defining criteria to sort of get that list down to something that's consumable and ingestible and usable by the end users. So I'll put my little disclaimer here right now. I am not the tech guy. I am not the dev team. So I've had conversations with my dev team, of course, but I'm not a developer myself. So I can't do this the justice that it really deserves, but I will speak to this somewhat. So RDF is the standard for public vocabularies, and you've probably heard of property graph databases and RDF graph databases, which I've heard described by somebody in my dev team as a holy war or a religious war. We're not going to go that far. We use Synaptica. We're very standards-based, so we use an RDF backend graph database. And that's our preference. We like to stick to the RDF standards, the semantic web standards. So RDF star is a very new standard that is not, to my knowledge, been used very extensively yet in the front end of a lot of these taxonomy and ontology tools. And this was our first foray into it, was that the requirements that they had to develop permissions were complex. And we needed to use this standard in order to develop the kind of complexity that our client Ubisoft needed. So the real practical significance here of RDF star, it increases how expressive your model can be with this new RDF resource type. It's called an embedded triple. Again, I'm not going to dive into triples. We can talk about it. If you have questions, we can talk about triples. I just didn't really want to get into the standards and all of that. If you know what triples are, this should make sense. But anyway, an embedded triple, it works as a pointer to an RDF star statement or an RDF statement. Basically what that allows us, if you know property graphs or you know subject predicate object structure, this triple, then you know that in a property graph you can label that relationship with information. And in RDF graph, that's much more difficult to do. And RDF star allows you to do that. So we kind of get some more semantic expressivity by using RDF star within an RDF graph database. So again, this is not my forte here, but this is just to say that in the past, with regular RDF, in the original specification, you could do what we wanted to do through a process called reification. But that reification process adds a lot of statements. So on the back end, to put it very simply, you are writing many, many, many triples. You're expanding the size of your back-end database by using this process of reification. So you can get the job done. It just creates more overhead, and which, depending on how your system is architected, can slow down your system. And there's more storage space. It's just, it's not the best way to do things. So with RDF star, and you can see in this example here, this is how you would have to do this statement. Abraham Lincoln, what position did he hold and when did he hold it? This is how you would have had to do this using RDF as it is out of the box, the original specification, using reification. However, using RDF star, this statement becomes a lot easier and it becomes a lot more concise and a lot more compact. So what this really helps to speed up the performance of the system and to basically just store less information on the back end. So after consolidating the new user and group access control and permissions model in Graphite from our old model, there was really no issues remapping the functionalities from the old model to the new. So we had triples without RDF star, and you could see that on the top illustration there. And then we had a much more simplified model when we moved to RDF star and started using that. So as I mentioned, there's some real advantages here. Performance. The performance was super fast by using RDF star. So we needed to express complex relationships with metadata associated as a triple, which would have bugged or potentially really slowed down or bogged down the system. So we use on our backend graph data, OntoText GraphDB. By using RDF star, it was much faster. We could nearly double the loading speed for some of our data sets by using RDF star. So in essence, this really simplified our permissions model and allowed us to give us this. Before we used RDF star, we could have users, and they were kind of managed just as users. With the implementation and this technical implementation, we have now a concept of groups. I am a user. I can belong to one or more groups. A group, of course, can have one or more users. And what that allows us to do is to define groups based on any criteria really you want. You can see in my screenshot here that it's like a project administrator, a system admin, a taxonomy editor versus a taxonomy viewer. But these are flexible. You could name these whatever you want. You could say my SharePoint administrator group. It could be a Confluence administrator group. It could be some other consuming system group. So you could do it by the software that's using it. In fact, one of our clients names one of their groups, and the only member, the only user, put that in quotes, of that group is an API call. So it's not a person, it's an API call. It's a robot, if you will, that has certain permissions to do certain things and read and write between these databases. And this allowed us to get really granular with having groups and users and very granular permissions on what people can do within a given vocabulary. And that all comes back to that governance and who's allowed in the system and what can they do. So we'll get to probably more familiar territory here with ontologies and content. So by doing this system the way they have, right, concepts can be connected by hierarchical relationships. We know what those are. Okay, equivalence relationships. We also know what those are. These are all straight out of the standards. We should all have systems that can support these. And they're connected by associative relationships. And what's nice is that we can connect our concepts to represent internal and external content, such as a wiki page. And that's what they're doing. When they create a wiki page, it creates a concept in Graphite. So it's really a stub. It's a concept. It's a thing that represents a real world thing, a real page out there in the world. So on the taxonomy backend, you can see both taxonomy concepts and you can see these concepts that represent real world objects. So getting into this, that internal and external content, they're real things. Those are pages, those are wiki pages. And we're representing sort of abstract concepts. In this example, I've got passion fruits. And that was probably in the Gemet or UNESCO thesaurus. It's a concept. I went out, I made a page about passion fruits, and that page is real and it's got real content and it's tagged with some of these concepts. And I'm also able to map between vocabularies. So you can see passion fruit and passion fruits. Two different vocabularies, I've mapped them together. So we're really getting to a knowledge graph. We're connecting multiple vocabularies and multiple and concepts with real world content out there in the world. So what else is Ubisoft doing? Well, this is where I wish Melanie were here, because she would be able to talk about all these. I know what these projects are on a high level, so I'll talk you a little bit through them. But hopefully we can make her content available and share it, or get some questions to her, as I mentioned, because she's going to have some great details and stories about these, and unfortunately I just won't know. So they've got a system they call Mana, and they're going to integrate that also with Graphite. And again, this is a stepwise move out into the organization. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the future state slide next, where they are bringing in and integrating more systems using a centralized taxonomy and ontology management system to manage the terms. They're onboarding more and more of those systems, which was why we had to do the permissions work, because they want to be able to say Mana users are a group, and maybe they all have the same permissions, maybe they have different permissions, but I want to be able to take them on board into this taxonomy management system collectively. I don't want to add 50 users one by one. I want to add 50 users as a group to say these are, say, Mana administrators. Okay, so that's why we delivered a lot of that permissions work for them, is to be able to onboard these other systems. So they want to make their internal social network more accessible by using control vocabularies, and they can make posts available by using this tagging, and they can share this knowledge from one to many platforms, and they can even based on the post ID, they can match the tags in Graphite and do some reporting on the back end, and find out what are the most used tags in the system, who's using which tags for what. And they are in this system, they'll still be accepting user-suggested topics, and they'll be able to conduct before and after metrics on this. They are also going to integrate their learning platform. And again, these are some of these projects I think are in process, and others are future state. So they want to integrate their learning platform so that this can suggest courses and content to users. And again, I wish I had some screenshots of this. I'll bet it's really nice. But anyway, they're going to integrate. Again, they're bringing in their content and marrying it up via vocabularies to other things like learning and academics and the courses. And then they're going to be using their SharePoint Online Connector, which is another integration point we have. And they're going to be using that for more official sites like diversity and inclusion and the contractual library. So it's interesting, they're sort of bringing together via the vocabularies sites which are content, sites which are learning, sites which are sort of formally sanctioned at the organizational level, but again, all kind of leveraging the same vocabularies. So their future state, and I have a big question mark in the corner, and that's where Melanie could talk about all the wonderful things they're going to do, because I know what they're doing today. What they're doing tomorrow is sort of endless. I mean, they've got a lot of plans, and they want to connect this ontology management system and this backend graph database. They're already connecting the Confluence wiki. They want to start using, they've not been using linked data very much yet, and they want to start using linked data. They want to bring in things like DBpedia to provide things like definitions and whatnot on their content or on their concepts, and present this to a front-end UI. They also want to start integrating more software and development code, which I think is an interesting use case. I don't know what that's going to look like, but they want to integrate that as well and be able to use the control vocabulary with their software and development code. And then also their digital assets, which I think is very intuitive. It makes a lot of sense to me. Digital assets and digital asset management systems don't always have the greatest tagging. I'm not going to specify anybody. I just have seen some, and they just don't. They're not as robust as a taxonomy and ontology management system. Again, they were built to house digital assets, not become ontology systems. So their tagging is okay, but I think you can do a lot more with it if you integrate it with a taxonomy ontology management system. You can do more with those digital assets. So, okay, so what are they getting out of this? The application of these control vocabulary as metadata, it allows the knowledge workers on that front end, and right now today it's using Confluence, if they'll have other systems, they can browse, they can search, and they can discover existing tags, concepts, and create new ones, and they'll be able to, by virtue of it being tagged from one location, discover other content. And they can see this content grouped by key topics, and they can contribute to the ontology directly, again, without accessing the ontology management software, which I think is important. It's not very flattering to describe taxonomy and ontology as plumbing, but I often do. When you go and buy a house, which I just did recently, so I've become Mr. Fix-It, you don't necessarily look at what's behind the walls. You look at, wow, this is a beautiful faucet, and does hot and cold water come out of the faucet when I turn it? That's what's important. The plumbing underneath, I shouldn't have to be an expert on plumbing to have a nice faucet and have hot and cold water come out. And taxonomies and ontologies can often be that. If you're a taxonomist, you're an ontologist, it matters to you on the front end. I hate to break it to you, not everybody cares as much about your taxonomy as you do. And these users, they might want to see those tags, they might want to see the content, they might want to have content brought together using taxonomies and ontologies, but they don't necessarily want to see it. So they can still participate in the construction of taxonomy concepts and the expansion of it without having to be experts, which I think is important. And then, of course, these governance processes to really support content and ontology management, that's all important. So this is a real key point here. Changes to the backend architecture. So some of the things we built into our system and the administrative functionality allows for a more scalable adoption and onboarding. And Melanie described it. I mean, she is, or her and her team is, within Ubisoft. They are proselytizing. They are doing a road show. Use whatever phrase you want, whether it's a tour. They have been sort of selling the benefits of using taxonomies and control vocabularies within knowledge management. And they've been selling the concept so well that they are extremely busy. They're sort of victims of their own success because now everybody wants to be on this and they want to be integrated and they want to have their systems so that things are more coherent and that they can better find and leverage content across their systems. And so they're onboarding systems, and with each system they onboard, they're onboarding people, right? So people, process, technology, it all goes together, as we know. So they're developing more governance policies. They're developing processes as they bring on these systems and as they bring on these new users. And again, this changes to that underlying structure using RDF star. As far as I know, we're one of the early adopters of RDF star, and it worked great, and we're probably going to find other uses for it, which is great. More importantly, it benefits Ubisoft directly. They asked for some of this functionality, and we gave it to them, but because of the way we develop software, we gave it to all of our clients. They all benefit from it. So anytime a client asks for something, we weigh that requirement and we say, does everybody need it? And if so, in what way should it be in the UI? How should we deliver it? Will they get benefits from it? So anyway, again, I really apologize that Melanie couldn't be here. She was extremely sick, and we've got a couple references here on some of the articles that'll be in the online presentation that'll be available to you. So again, I apologize that Melanie couldn't be here. She could have added so much more, but I'm sure she'll be able to follow up with us in the future and answer some of these questions and provide some of that content. So thanks very much.
You did just fine, Aaron.
Well, thanks.
I had the pleasure of doing some taxonomy strategy work with Ubisoft in the past, and they've actually presented at the conference, I want to say like 3 years ago. So I think you did good in representing some of the cool projects that they are working on. I think one of the key things that kind of triggered part of this project is actually an artifact of the evolution of taxonomy. So they actually had a really gigantic folksonomy back in the early 2000s when folksonomy was all the rage because it seems so much easier to do than taxonomy, and it just seems so user-centric. And we had all these like, I don't know if you remember, like it was Digit or a couple of different apps that let you like tag your URLs and your bookmarks and whatnot. So they had really heavily leaned into folksonomy at the time, but that makes it really difficult to do any kind of integration or interoperability between applications. So I think part of this was them thinking, well, we can't let go of that user-centric angle to it,
Right.
but we need to find a way to bring all of this great folksonomy under the umbrella of the taxonomy and do a better job of connecting social content with more curated knowledge. So
Yeah, and that's that's exactly why they wanted to govern it this way, because it was really important to them, right? That obviously from what you've described and from what I've heard from them, it sounds like they had to find that balancing act of our users cannot be cut out of the loop. They need to be included. They need to be able to suggest terms, but it can't be insanity. They can't just suggest whatever they want and we just adopt it and magically your folksonomy just forms itself into a taxonomy. We know that doesn't really happen.
And I've had the privilege of working with a couple of game design companies, and the game development process is kind of this interesting silo creating process where every game is literally its own little island of people and content and knowledge. And yet there's a lot of reusable concepts or a lot of reusable techniques and ideas that do cross from game to game. And that was another piece of this knowledge management team's focus, was how can we get the content and the learnings that come out of game A to bubble up to the surface and be accessible to those who are working on game B who may not think to be able to go and look through all that content. So being able to do federated search and enterprise taxonomy layer across all of those different game silos becomes a really strategic focus for them. So we don't currently have any questions. So I'll give everyone a couple of seconds. If you have any last minute questions for Aaron, go ahead and paste those in the chat. Otherwise,
in the meantime, I will just say that what I really like about Ubisoft's story is that it's very, even though they're going to be using they're going to be doing a lot of different things. I love how knowledge management oriented this is. I feel like somehow in some ways taxonomy and ontology gets divorced from knowledge management, which seems crazy. To me, anyway, it seems crazy. And the fact that they took it as part and parcel, like knowledge management must have these things together, and we're going to go out there in the organization, we're going to convince people that this is the way to go, and they've been successful. And like I said, it's sort of, they've been victims of their own success. They're like, they have no time to do anything because they're constantly integrating and onboarding, and they're so busy winning, they don't have any time to do anything else, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think definitely knowledge management is a huge part for any organization, even an organization like Ubisoft, whose ultimate goal is to sell games. You'd think taxonomy for product marketing or pushing content to users would be their prime focus. But really, even when you're creating a game, you're probably going to do an Assassin's Creed 2 and an Assassin's Creed 3 and so on. So you do need to have a thread of knowledge transfer throughout the different game teams and the different roles on a particular game. It's a matter of creating that organizational memory, as well as being able to put out a specific product just in time.
And they're building this wiki they build worlds, right? That's what they do. They build software game worlds, and they are representing that world, and they have to represent it somehow, right? And so they're modeling their world using ontologies, and they're representing it in textual wiki pages.
We do have one question from DT, who's asking about what some of the key rules or thought processes that you need to have in place when managing this candidate process. So especially when you're doing with like raw user generated tags and feedback, what kinds of rules do you have to put into place to make sure what gets elevated into the enterprise taxonomy is good?
Yeah, and this gets back to the the people, process, and technology, I mean, you can't do just one of those pillars, right? And so with taxonomy management and governance, yeah, I mean, so I work for a company, we make a software, okay, and we build a lot of stuff into that software, governance and workflow stuff. But it wouldn't, you're only going to get so far with that. You need documentation and you need governance policies that are written and accessible, and I'm sure they're probably in a wiki page somewhere that they access, that they update. So some of this is enforced by the system, right? Like, I am not going to allow concepts in the candidate status to be shown on the front end to end users. That's a business rule. It's a technology rule. So that there's that aspect, and then there's the governance documents, which would say only after review and only after approval can these people who have these permissions in the system do this thing and elevate it to. So what they do is they have their internal experts review that candidate term, which again, it goes into another scheme as a candidate term, so it's never seen by any external users. And that's a technology thing where it's locked down to certain permissions and certain users to be able to see those. And then they review it, they put it through a review process, and that, again, that's all functionality in the system where they manually review and they manually put in some of the edits and update dates and things like that. And then they'll have automated things like a report. So they can generate a report and it's scheduled, and you can set that schedule for daily, weekly, monthly, whatever you want. And so I could have, say, a scheduled report that ran on a Friday night or a Monday morning. And so when I come into work on Monday, what are all the new candidate concepts which have been added? And I look at my report and I say, oh, here they all are. Here's all the new ones that I haven't dealt with yet. Let's either I deal with them or I parse them out to my team to deal with them. They review them, and once they're satisfied, and it depends on the organization. Maybe the taxonomist is enough, and they say, this is a great term, I like it, approved, I put it in its place where it should go in the right scheme. Or maybe it's more of, maybe it's a wider governance than that, where you have to invite in content or subject matter experts. Say, like, I think this is a good concept. I'll have the SME review it. The SME can go in and review, and they could say, yeah, the definition looks good, or maybe they supply the definition and they fill out more additional information and then they elevate it. So all of those things really need to be taken into consideration. What can the technology do, but then what are your human beings doing, and what processes are they following?
David wants to know which Synaptica products are included in the material that you shared. So what is Ubisoft building on?
Yeah, so we do our Graphite is taxonomy and ontology management, and then we have two dedicated connectors. One is to Confluence, one is SharePoint, and so they're using our Graphite and our connectors. Everything else, and then we've got sort of generic REST-based APIs, and so really it's up to them to say, I have a system that I built. I think I'm not sure if mine is homegrown or not, but they've got, yeah, okay. So they've got homegrown and they've got commercial software, and they've got a development team internally. And this is why I know some things, but I don't know everything, because they have internal processes where they take our APIs, they connect them to other systems, and sometimes we know what they're connecting and how, and other times we don't. We don't need to know, so we don't have those meetings. We don't talk about those things. And I do know that when they filter concepts out to some of these systems, they want to be able to search and sort in certain ways. So we've had to do a little bit with our REST-based APIs, again, for them to say, okay, I can change the way that things are ordered, let's say, right? Like, I want something besides an alphabetical sort order, I want something else. So a lot of that work they've done themselves internally. So anything beyond the SharePoint, Confluence, and the actual taxonomy tool, they've done themselves.
Great. We have a question from Carolyn, who's asking a great question about how products can be tracked through the life cycle. Often products will start out their lives with some sort of a code name like Project Ultra or something cool, especially in a gaming company, until it gets assigned its actual name.
Right.
And then you have different names for things in the finance department than you do for marketing, for example. Are you any thoughts on how you govern those different existences?
Yeah, and they're doing all of that. So again, some of that is permissions. And just as you mentioned, there are projects and concepts that just by virtue of you seeing it, you know what's coming. And so I am going to lock you out of that and only allow certain people with certain permissions to access a particular project because it's top secret. It's a game in development, and only certain people can see it. So they can hide entire vocabularies, they can hide certain fields, they can hide certain concepts, and that's again if you're working within the system, but even for what's integrated. So there's that aspect of locking things down and permissioning. Um, Through the life cycle, again, it kind of depends on that, the technology married up with the business processes of how you escalate that, and whether you move that through just a concept life cycle or you're managing it at the scheme level, and the whole scheme is sort of managed as a life cycle and versioning process. And again, it's interesting. They're connecting real world things. So if you had a product development page or website or groups of websites, you can still represent those as sort of like stub concepts within the system. So you're really getting connection of the concepts and the actual content.
Yeah. And also, you may have different identifiers, a financial
Yep.
code for your ERP, or you might have the
Right.
user-friendly code for the store. But all of that can get maintained on the same concept as various versions of that same concept.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron.
Well, thank you.
Kudos to you for making do without your co-presenter, but I think we all got a lot out of this. So thank you
Awesome.
very much,
Great.
and hope to see you all in the next session.